You're listening to CX Passport, the show about creating great customer experiences with a dash of travel talk. Each episode, we'll talk with our guests about great CX, travel, and just like the best journeys, explore new directions we never anticipated. I'm your host, Rick Denton. I believe the best meals are served outside and require a passport. Let's get going. So, if I asked you where you think a career in customer experience would start, how far down the list would the answer trading grain be for you? Wasn't expecting that? Neither was I when I met today's guest, Michael Hinshaw, introduced to me by one of my favorite CX people, Diane Majors, who also has appeared on CX Passport way back in episode 9. She's got single-digit OG status. I knew that Michael would be a fount of customer experience wisdom. As the president of MCorpCX, Michael designs and implements technology solutions for customer-centric companies. These solutions can create real, tangible business value for MCorpCX's clients. When someone writes a book titled Smart Customers, Stupid Companies, you know you're going to get some unvarnished customer experience discussion. Michael, welcome to CX Passport.
Thanks so much, Rick. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I got to start with right at the beginning. How on earth do you go from trading grain to driving customer experience across a multitude of companies?
Well, as you might expect, it's somewhat of an interesting story, but not horribly original. In that I had built a brand strategy firm and sold it in 1997. And was approached by one of my ex-clients at that point, who was a head of a private equity group out of Canada. And they asked me if I'd be interested in starting an internet company at that point in time.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time talking about ideas, settled conception on the idea of a marketplace, essentially bringing buyers and sellers together on a single platform, and then narrowed that down to oil, and essentially equipment for drilling and exploration, and grain. And we decided to go for grain, primarily because it was there in Canada. They knew the grain market to a degree, but I knew nothing whatsoever about it. So I went from zero understanding of grain, much less trading grain, much less farming, and little understanding of Canada, to being the largest independent grain trader in the country in about 2 years.
Goodness.
We also managed crops, had over 100,000 acres of farmland under management, and then began trading freight, essentially arbitraging freight, because our grain needed to get to market, and trucks going across the country, it was more expensive to have them turn around with an empty load. So our marketplace expanded to include things like fertilizer, seed inputs, and freight. But the reason that ended up being a customer experience training ground is because I knew nothing about the market. So I went into the ecosystem of grain trading with an entirely open mind and started asking questions. And I started asking questions with an eye towards understanding where the pain points in the market were, where the gaps are, where there was friction in the process, what the life cycle, and at that point I was calling it a relationship life cycle, what the relationship life cycle looked like for each of the major players. For brokers, for farmers, for the large suppliers of inputs like Cargill and ADM, and found some pretty significant need and built a business to fill those needs. After the internet crash of late 2001, early 2002, we sold the assets that we built, the technology assets. I took a year off and then started MCorpCX. And used the framework, the customer relationship life cycle, as our foundation for starting a customer experience consulting firm. And so early day journey mapping, you could call it. We called it touch point mapping when I went to commercialize it, and trademarked that phrase in 2002, and have been doing that kind of work ever since for corporations of all sizes, types, and kinds around the world.
Yeah. Who would have ever thought, right, going from trading grain? But that makes complete sense. If you don't know something about something, what better way to understand it, and that is to get insights from the ones that are either doing it or a part of it, or getting that customer insight, for lack of a better term. And I think it's funny hearing evolution of the phrase that we all know as journey mapping today. It's a shame that you didn't get a chance to trademark journey mapping, right?
Well, I did try and patent touchpoint mapping, which is
Yeah.
essentially the exact same concept as journey
Right.
mapping. However, I made the mistake of publishing a white paper and was told by the lawyers that, you learn every day, which is a wonderful thing, that if I had published a white paper, it was in the public domain, I could no longer patent it. I could
Oh,
trademark the names.
well, my goodness, listeners, hey, you just got a little bit of free trademark insight that I didn't even know. Gosh, I would have thought that that would almost lay more ground for you to have the right
Okay.
for the trademark or the patent for that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. So in any case, a learning experience.
Yeah. Well, so let's take that into kind of current day. I love the fact that it was trade and grain, but it is fundamentally it's all getting that insight from the customers, understanding the customer. And when I think of that total voice of the customer approach, it involves the technology you're describing, that idea of getting a voice of the customer tool integrated with the company, along with the human, the processes, the culture of voice of the customer. How have you seen companies successfully do both?
Yeah. Well, the biggest challenge, which you've hinted at, is the reality that technology won't fix it.
Right.
And many organizations are investing a lot of money in, particularly enterprise level, voice of the customer listening, enterprise feedback management, pick your phrase to describe it, but it's all the same thing. It's how do you listen to your customers, understand what they're thinking, feeling, and doing, and take the appropriate actions to improve their experiences and your business results. And everything except for the listening analysis part has, well, actually, even those have a lot of human component as well. But you need to clearly define roles and responsibilities, which help to drive alignment and accountability for individuals across the organization. So the companies that do this really well, they know that technology won't fix it alone. And they work hard to cascade VoC insights down and across the organization.
Yeah.
That, combined with clearly defined roles and responsibilities in relation to customer insights and a culture of alignment and accountability to make that happen, is what companies do to succeed.
That idea of cascading VoC, voice of the customer insights throughout the organization. It was, I think it was today. I was on a LinkedIn conversation with someone saying almost that exact same thing. That was one of her most exciting things, is getting voice of the customer and sharing those insights across the organization. But I got to imagine it's easy for you and me to sit on a call here and say that, but it's got to be a little bit challenging for companies. How, when it's not a part of their initial DNA, hey, we bought a tool, but it's not necessarily part of their DNA sharing. How do you help them get to that? How do you get them into that sharing concept that the customer needs to be, it's not just, those customer experience people, but rather across the whole org?
Yeah, and that does require, as you might expect, some leadership weight behind it, more often than not.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even organizations where leadership isn't completely bought into the idea of customer centricity as a business model, there are people in the organization interested in what customers think. And so ideally top down, reality is oftentimes it's middle out, middle down. And in those situations, it's finding champions inside the organization who are passionate about the customer and take that voice back into other parts of the organization. It's also incumbent on the VoC pros to ensure that they're not just handing out data.
Yes.
Because we see that all the time. It's like, gee, great, nice PowerPoint presentation, nice dashboard, zero relevance to me.
Yeah.
So that goes back to making sure that when you share insights, they actually are insights. It's not just the insights label on a pack of data.
We're almost it's almost layering upon layers here. So we're asking a group, when you're trying to share your insights about the customer, to know your internal customer well enough to provide the insights that would matter to them, the internal customer, about the external customer. Oh my goodness, I'm getting myself all tied up here with all sorts of meta layers associated with this. So
yes, that's also the job, or a big part of the job, for customer experience.
Yeah.
Rarely, other than when the CX/VoC teams have budget for the technology and for the analysis and the creation and distribution of insights, more often than not, the budget stops there, meaning they don't have P&L responsibility. They don't have the ability in most cases to actually go and quote unquote do stuff in the org. They can't make anyone do anything.
Right.
And the only way that we've seen CX groups, and again, in influence position, really succeed is when they understand what it takes to socialize and lead by influencing, guiding, and coaching rather than by dictate, budget, and command structure.
That's so true. And sure, they might get, let's say that it was their ability to dictate it. You might get some compliance, but you wouldn't get your commitment, right? That classic phrase. So
Yep.
it is so important.
This is your captain speaking. I want to thank you for listening to CX Passport today. We've now reached our cruising altitude, so I'll turn that seatbelt sign off. While you're getting comfortable, hit that follow or subscribe button on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Love it if you'd tell a friend about CX Passport, leave a review so others can discover the show as well. Now, sit back and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Well, so I imagine you've walked into some messy situations. So I would love to ask you, and certainly no names, we're not talking about names, but what's one of the messiest customer experience situations you've walked into, and how did you help turn that around?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, and again, unsurprisingly, customer experience is messy in most organizations. And it's messy because of the nature of the way that businesses are traditionally structured. They look at the world from the inside out. They design processes to suit the way that they do business rather than the ways that their customers want business to be done. They're siloed. They've got different business and command structures. They don't talk back and forth across parts of the organization, different divisions, different responsibilities. The companies that call us tend to be more self-aware organizationally.
Right.
They also tend to be a little bit better shape because by the time you reach out to a firm like mine, where we're expert at helping companies really improve their capabilities, all up around customer experience management, they've made some decisions internally. They've almost always had some sort of test case pilot scenarios, team members internally who've done some journey mapping work or voice of the customer, and they see the value in it. So all that being said, it may not be that everyone in the organization is as self-aware, or that everyone in the organization is interested in moving towards customer centricity.
Right.
So I'll give you one example of that, and this is really illustrative. This is many years ago, but it's still a good example. We were hired by a company that was headquartered in New York, a financial services firm, and part of our job shortly thereafter in the discovery process is going around and meeting with every one of the 8 or so presidents of different operating divisions of this group, to understand their view. And I was in, I believe it was Miami, elevator flight up, 50 stories, beautiful views. I'm sitting across the desk. This guy's got an amazing office corner view of the ocean.
Oh man, I'm just visualizing it.
Oh my gosh.
I bet that was really, really nice.
It was pretty impressive. And of course, desk appropriately positioned, power desk, right? Up against the windows, light behind him, standard, right? But when I asked him about his customers, he laughed. He says, "I don't have customers.
Oh,
I've got a portfolio."
What?
I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look, let's be real. You're down here from New York. They want to do this customer centricity thing. I get it. But the reality is I make my money when my files don't pay, because I go out and I ding them. I get late fees. I am paid based on how much money I generate from my file." And he said, until the guys up in New York turn to me and say, "Bob," and his name's Bob, not Bob, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
Until the guys up in New York turn to me and say, "Bob, we're going to pay you based on how happy the customers you have in your file are." Says, "I don't care about it."
Wow.
So, but very self-aware guy. Very smart.
Yeah, I love the honesty. I mean,
yeah. And he's just like, you know what? Change my comp structure, I'll change my behavior.
wow.
And I mean, that was essentially the bottom line. And looked at that way, when you recognize the importance of aligning rewards and compensation to desired outcomes, I'm sure you've seen this many times as well, where you've got sales forces in organizations that are pivoting towards customer centricity. And the mandate for sales is you got a $200 million quota.
Right.
I don't care who you sell to or what you sell them, but you better sell or you're out of here.
Right.
Well, until you at least have a percentage of that comp, because obviously sales people need to sell, but until you have at least a percentage of that comp lined up against the ways that customers feel about the services that they've purchased, you're going to have continued disconnects.
Boy, what a great story. And I really do. I mean, I actually admire the salty honesty of the person that you met there in Miami, but it makes sense. And I've talked a lot about in other conversations the incentives when it comes to voice of the customer and just customer experience in general. There's capital I incentives. That's the dollars. That's the bonuses. That's the commissions. But there's also lowercase I incentives, celebrations, motivation, praise, those kind of things. Those are part of it too. But I love that story there because a lot of times companies will say, look, we don't have anything for the capital I incentives. Well, you know what? Sometimes you really need to look at that and actually consider it.
Yeah, and also when you think about levels of an organization, in my experience, when you get deeper into the organization, those lowercase I incentives have greater impact.
Absolutely.
But the folks at the top,
capital I.
Capital I. Not always. And they're happy to get perks, provided capital I is well accounted for.
Yeah, right. Capital I first. We'll talk about that lowercase later. You know, and one of the things that you said too, and I forget exactly the phrasing that you had there, but the sales organizations that are customer centric, one of the dangers with capital I incentives, and I've seen it at companies where they will tie it to like an NPS score or something like that, and then suddenly gaming comes into play and how that can manifest, right? And so you have to put guardrails around that. But one of the things that I also saw in an organization is the company made its revenue off of the longevity of a customer's relationship with the company. It was, to call it subscription based is the wrong term, but for the sake of discussion, let's just call it subscription based. And so the sales team, all they cared about was making that sale. They were compensated on number of deals that were made, and that was their compensation. But it didn't matter if it was a crappy deal and the person left 2 weeks later. They still got compensated for it. No. And so the company realized, and it was actually a voice of the customer engagement that I was a part of, was, okay, we got to find a way to improve the overall experience. Oh my gosh, a lot of that ties way back at the beginning of making sure that the salespeople are selling deals that are for the best benefit of the customer. How can we do that? Let's fix capital I incentives to make sure that the longevity of the relationship actually has some skin in the game for that salesperson.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm actually still sitting here visualizing the Miami story there, which makes me want to pivot a little bit away from someone who doesn't want to care about customer experience, understandably so. But let's talk about travel for a bit. When you and I had talked before, you'd mentioned some interesting travel places, South Africa, Austria, but you mentioned Kuwait. That one really stood out to me. I've never had the opportunity to go there. Tell me about traveling there. What was that like?
It was really interesting. I was there on business.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a place that I would have selected as a vacation spot, but I always enjoy going to new places almost regardless of what they're like, because the experience is pretty remarkable no matter where you go. And one of the things that really struck me about Kuwait is it's a country of extremes, and so just absolute a lot of wealth. But as I understand it, it's really the Kuwaiti citizens who are the wealthiest because they get minimum payments from the government. But there's also a huge population there that are not citizens, including some, as I understand it, that were born there, may have been there multi-generationally, but they are not afforded citizenship either. And so you see these extremes, and in fairness, it's not radically different extremes that I see in my hometown of San Francisco.
I was going to say.
And across the bay in Oakland, right? So extremes are every place. But it was a little more obvious to me there because it wasn't, the wealth wasn't something I expected to see as obviously. A story, we were there doing a project for a multinational company that owned lots of businesses, and their CX pilot project was their auto distribution group. Okay. And so they're the largest distributor of, I won't name the brand, but it's because everyone will know exactly who they are, but it was a Japanese auto and truck manufacturer, was one of their, I think, 4 or 5 brands. That was their biggest. And they're telling stories about people who would, buy the car, like buy a large 4-wheel drive SUV, take it out in the desert, get it stuffed full of sand, and abandon it in the desert.
Oh my gosh!
And just come back and buy another one.
Oh my gosh! Holy cow!
Not horribly uncommon, apparently.
That seems like there'd be a wonderful secondary market then of people that just go salvage those vehicles, repair, and then.
I'm sure there is.
Oh,
Yeah, and it's also a reason why test drives are not encouraged.
when we're talking about this kind of travel, it can be a little disorienting. It's nice to take a little break from time to time. So I'd like for you to join me here in the First Class Lounge. We'll move quickly here and hopefully have a little bit of fun. What is a dream travel location from your past?
Man, there are many. I have to say, in the immediate in the period of time immediately preceding the pandemic,
Yeah.
I have three. So probably in the 18 months or maybe the 12 months before then, I went to Slovenia, Edinburgh, and South Africa. And each of those locations just really struck me. I could live in Slovenia or Edinburgh. South Africa, I'd love to go back and visit again. But
gosh, those do sound really neat. I'd like to join you on those go back trips at some point. Looking forward, what is a dream travel location you've not been to yet?
Morocco.
Ooh, tell me why. That was a very quick answer. Morocco's first on your list. Why is that?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily first on my list, but it's definitely top of mind. I have a number of friends who've spent time mountain biking and trekking and hiking in Morocco, and they've just made it sound so incredible that I was like, I really want to go do that.
Ooh, that does sound neat. One of the things about Morocco I've heard is the food, and so that inspires me to ask this question often, and that is, what is a favorite thing to eat?
Oh, I like. I like all food, which is wonderful. There's really nothing that I don't like to eat,
Right.
which is also good. But I think Asian cuisine in general is probably my favorite. And of that, I don't know if there's one particular thing. I love, rice bowls, spicy curries, things of that nature. But
Oh, I'm getting a little hungry here.
yeah,
Actually,
my wife is an exceptionally good chef, and in one of those enlightened self-interest giving situations, I gave her lessons to Asian cooking school a number of years ago. So,
the gift that keeps giving. Well played,
indeed.
sir. Well played. On the other side, what is a thing your parents forced you to eat but you hated as a kid?
You know what? My parents didn't force me to anything, which was great. But the other side of it is that I liked almost everything. I'd say the thing that I liked least of the things that we ate regularly was eggplant.
Oh yeah. Oh, you've got me with that one. I still can't touch the stuff. Not a fan at all.
I can eat it, but I'm not going to order it.
You'll tolerate. It'll sit on the plate. Well, I'm not that picky, but you're right. It's certainly would be nothing that I would order. What is, when you're in your travels, one travel item that you will not leave home without? Not including your phone, of course, but you will not leave home without.
Drawing pad. So photographs are great, and like you, right? I've got zillions of photographs stuck in a digital drive someplace, and the ones that I tend to remember are the ones that I actually print out, or the ones that I printed out before they were all in a digital drive someplace. But drawing something, I tend to draw scenes of nature like rivers and mountains and stuff like that, buildings occasionally. I'm not very good at people, but it really cements the place in my mind in a way that taking pictures doesn't.
You might have a side business of showing that to folks sometime. We're not on video here, so I'm not going to ask you to pull that out, but it would be interesting to see that.
I do have my pad with me.
Yeah. So thinking back to our conversations around customer experience, and imagine too, as you're going into companies and they're evaluating, how do I bring you in? How can I justify this? There's all sorts of conversation around what is the ROI of customer experience. I get into these debates with folks from time to time. On one hand, you hear you got to have the ROI. We may hear no CFO will let a customer experience project go forward without ROI. But I've also heard a nice counter argument from another CX Passport guest, Nick Zeisler, back in episode 19, where he talks about that nobody asked for the ROI of HR, nobody asked for the ROI of the finance group. So why should customer experience be any different, is his perspective. So I'm curious, how do you approach that balance between the need to, quote, prove CX and the ambition that customer experience should be as fundamental as those other organizations?
So that was a really interesting comment. And I applaud that perspective. I think it's a really interesting way to position that to executives. But the reality is that customer experience is new.
Yeah.
And that organizations that are successful and have been successful without customer experience don't really see a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, right?
Right.
But in many cases. And we've worked with organizations that have, pulled their customer experience. They've stood it up, said it didn't work, yanked it out. No impact on the business, good or bad, right?
Yeah.
And of course, they think later, our competition is doing this. We need to really get our act together. So they call us back in to help,
Right. Hey.
which is fine. Then it's standing it up, but it's standing it up in a way that the organization can see the value of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that many organizations when the ROI conversation comes up, and it's an easy one because everyone likes ROI, right? What's bad about ROI?
Right.
But it's really a catchphrase for value. So if you can prove the value of CX to the business, then you're significantly more likely to get that project funded or agreement to promote it or to do the roadshow, or that might be. And going back to the argument that you were noting Nick made, if you're a successful business and you strip out all your people functions, you're going to fail.
Right.
If you're in a successful business, strip out all your finance functions, you're going to fail. If you strip out all your CX functions, so what, right? Unless the organization has implemented CX in a way that it's driving measurable value that executives, shareholders, and other stakeholders can look at and say, we need to keep doing this. And that value is oftentimes measured in, guess what? Dollars.
Yeah. And I like that perspective because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And that is, it's one thing to sort of say that you're doing CX, but it's another to actually get in there and really implement from a technology perspective, implement it not just from the technology, but the processes, the culture, all of that are the building blocks around that value of CX.
Couple of years ago, I think it was Forrester, pointed out that the life of a CXO or a CCO
right.
was exceedingly short compared to other C-suite executives, and that the number of organizations that were actually putting new CXOs in place was dropping, right. And their position was because not, and this wasn't their language as I recall, it wasn't because of lack of ROI necessarily, it was because of that lack of value. And if you come in and just do the VoC stuff and just turn the crank, provide insights and information, but don't help the organization change how they work as a result of that, right? Then change the way that people think, act, and operate in the organization, and do so in ways that drive value, then you're going to have a very, very difficult time getting the investment dollars up front to make that happen.
And I'm looking at the clock. That actually, I kind of want to close out with this, is that value statement that you're describing. I didn't anticipate going this direction, but I really like that idea of it's ROI to value. And I'm thinking about MCorpCX going in and having those conversations with a client. How are you helping them get through that journey from ROI into the value of it? Where do you start with them? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, value comes from three primary areas in our experience, and there's many sub areas. So like, don't hold me too tightly to that. It's you can decrease operating costs, you can increase top and bottom line revenue, and you can increase the value of your customers. And increasing the value of the customers, share a wallet, retention, etc. And these aren't mutually exclusive. It's a Venn diagram; they all overlay each other. Right? If you serve your customers well and you don't do the things they don't value, then you can reduce your operating costs. You do those two things well, you increase your top line and your bottom line. But when we talk about value, those are the kinds of things that we look at helping organizations do. And it's rarely is it CX for CX's sake.
Right.
It's CX for a business purpose. And that value can be measured, for example, in ability to differentiate from the competition. There's dollars attached to that. If you can acquire customers more easily, increasing your customer value, get more quickly, accelerate their movement through your life cycle, get them out of consideration into close more quickly. All of those things are measurable value areas for an organization. And the reality is there's a lot of different ways to track and trace that aren't complex, but getting the underlying information to do it correctly is.
Yeah. Well, I I love that approach. I love the three. I'm actually was typing those notes down. One of the beauties of being a host of CX Passport is I get to learn, and I get to learn even before the listeners because I get to hear it first. But Michael, that was really helpful to hear that. How, if folks want to know more about your approach or the approach of MCorpCX and see how that could be of value to them, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, you can visit our website, MCorp.CX. Or you can drop me a note, mhinshaw at MCorp.CX, and be happy to take any questions or comments. I enjoy chatting with folks about this. It's one of the reasons I'm enjoying chatting with you so much. It's always nice to talk about things that, with somebody who's passionate about the subject that you're also passionate about. So.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for that. And I will get all that into the show notes. So you didn't have to write that down. Just scroll down. You'll see this in the show notes, how best to get in touch with Michael and MCorpCX. Michael, thanks so much for today. Seriously, I was taking notes and learned some significant little nuggets there today, and I appreciate that. I certainly appreciated also hearing about Kuwait and the travels there, and you made me really jealous with some of the places you've been as well. A lot of fun today, Michael. Thank you so much for being here on CX Passport.
Rick, my absolute pleasure. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on CX Passport. Make sure to visit our website, cxpassport.com, where you can hit subscribe so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, you can check out the rest of the EX4CX website. If you're looking to get real about customer experience, EX4CX is available to help you increase revenue by starting to listen to your customers and create great experiences for every customer every time. Thanks for listening to CX Passport, and be sure to tune in for our next episode. Until next time, I'm Rick Denton, and I believe the best meals are served outside and require a passport.